Govern is going to come in a little later to give their remarks. I am Boris Hussain. I'm the South Asia Policy Analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I wanted to thank the Lantos Human Rights Commission for hosting this discussion on issues confronting the Ahmadiyya community around the world. As one of the most persecuted subgroups in the Islamic world, the Ahmadiyya community faces multifaceted challenges and threats that our panelists today will explain in the context of Pakistan, Algeria, and from a global perspective. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, who will speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for questions as well. You can find their biographies for the speakers outside on the table, but to just give a general overview of everyone, Mahmoud Ahmed, who's sitting at the far left, is the Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA and the General Secretary for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association USA. Seated next to me, Farnaz Isfahani, is a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a Senior Fellow for South and Southeast Asia at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. In the middle is Eric Goldstein, who is Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division. To begin, we're going to go ahead and shift over to Mahmoud, who's going to give us a sort of global perspective on the Ahmadiyya community and perhaps some of the challenges they face.
Good morning, everybody. As Boris said, my name is Mahmoud Ahmad. I'm the Deputy National Director of Public Affairs for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community here in the United States, and also serve as the General Secretary of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Lawyers Association here in the United States. I want to thank the distinguished co-chairs of this esteemed commission for the privilege of appearing before them today, and to also recognize the co-chairs of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Caucus for their support in organizing this important briefing. I've been asked today to provide sort of a thumbnail sketch of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and the persecution that it faces worldwide, which is a topic, of course, of great concern to our community. Before I sort of delve into that, let me give a brief introduction of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community for those of you who may not have it. The community was founded in 1889, so more than 125 years ago, and it is a revivalist movement within Islam. Ahmadi Muslims profess to be Muslim in every respect of that word, which is an important component of the persecution that they face. And a central tenet of their Islamic faith is that we reject terrorism for any and all reasons. And that has been part of our DNA from the very day that our founder, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, established the community in Qadian, which was then part of British India. Today, our community is established in more than 200 countries, and its tens of millions of adherents follow the only spiritual caliph of the Muslim world, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, who resides in London. And the community is the largest organized Muslim community with a single leader in the world. Now, turning to the topic of the persecution of Ahmadi Muslims, let me begin by saying that from the very beginning, religious extremists who subscribe to a violent ideology of armed jihad opposed this new community that rejected any violence in the name of religion. So that was true even in the late 19th century in India, is that those forces of extremism who wanted to advance a worldview in which different religions would be pinned against each other, and there would be violent struggle between religions and among adherents of a particular religion, saw this new teaching of peace and coexistence as a threat to the kind of worldview they wanted to advance. And if you then follow the story of radicalization around the Muslim world, something that has obviously come into stark relief for the audience here in the United States ever since the awful attacks on September 11, 2001, you will see that the story of radicalization in the Muslim world and the persecution of Ahmadi Muslims is really of one piece. And so, sadly, today, if you look around the Muslim world, Ahmadi Muslims face persecution in virtually every part. And in virtually every part of the Muslim world, Ahmadi Muslims were at the forefront of establishing peaceful countries with a secular worldview. For example, in Pakistan, which Farnaz will touch on in a few minutes, Ahmadi Muslims were instrumental in the creation of Pakistan. And Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, relied on Ahmadi Muslims as an essential part of the coalition that he had to advance his worldview of a pluralistic, inclusive version of Pakistan. And its first foreign minister, Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, was a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and advocated for those very values. Sadly, since then, as you will hear, things have deteriorated massively. And the very community that was instrumental in creating the country and advancing a pluralistic vision for the country is now subjected to persecution, not only at the hands of religious extremists and terrorists, but also at the hands of the state, which is now largely captive to those forces. And that story does not end in Pakistan. It carries across the world. For example, in Indonesia, arguably one of the most populous countries of Muslims in the world. Again, Ahmadi Muslims have been there since the 1920s. They are a tremendously positive force for good in that country, and yet today, Indonesia, supposedly a moderate Muslim country, discriminates rampantly against Ahmadi Muslims, among other minorities, of course, Christians and others. And Ahmadi Muslims have been brutally murdered, their mosques have been destroyed, the community is essentially proscribed. Turning to places like the Middle East and North Africa, conditions for Ahmadi Muslims are, if anything, even more precarious. Although their numbers are smaller, and therefore the sheer number of acts of persecution may be smaller for that reason, they are forced to live underground. In Saudi Arabia, for example, Ahmadi Muslims are not even allowed to step inside the country, let alone have any kind of established existence. Similarly, in countries around the Middle East, the community, to the extent it exists very quietly, without a lot of public footprint, and really cannot function in a meaningful way. And Eric, of course, will speak to particularly the conditions in Algeria that have emerged in recent years as a topic of particular concern. Even in countries that were established post-1989, in the post-Soviet era, even though they were operating on what one would say is a blank slate, even in those countries, Ahmadi Muslims are facing a lot of discrimination and hurdles. For example, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, two of the former Soviet republics, Central Asian countries, there are restrictions now on any religious group being established, but in particular, any kind of Muslim group that is outside the narrowly proscribed mainstream state-run Islamic worldview is looked on with a lot of suspicion, and our community, though we have fulfilled all the requirements legally for registering in those countries, has faced tremendous difficulty in getting established, has repeatedly been at the losing end of court decisions and interventions by state security forces. And so, and if you take this then to the highest level, at the level of the Organization for Islamic Countries, at the OIC level, you will see these same issues playing out. Resolutions have been passed at the OIC calling for Ahmadis to be the subject of discrimination, calling for Ahmadis to be declared non-Muslim. And so this is not an isolated series of events. It is really, as I said at the beginning, the work of the same ideological forces that are driving extremism around the Muslim world, often with state intervention at their behest, really trying to trample down on this community. And so it is a microcosm of the types of issues that are being faced by the Muslim world today. I think I'll stop with that global introduction, and hopefully that other panelists can expound on this a bit in terms of the specific countries that are being covered. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mahmoud. That was a really great, I think, global perspective for us to get sort of an overview of the issues that are facing the Ahmadi community. So now let's turn to one of the countries you mentioned, Pakistan, and I'll turn it over to Farnaz Tahani to take over for discussing the Ahmadi issues in Pakistan.
Thank you so much to the Tom Lantos Commission on Human Rights for inviting me here to speak about one of Pakistan's most oppressed groups, the Ahmadi Muslims. I have written a book about Pakistan's religious minorities, all of them, Muslim and non-Muslim. And we are today going to speak about Ahmadi Muslims in the light of Pakistan. Before I get to all the details of what has happened to the Ahmadis today, I want to just quickly talk about how did Pakistan get to this point. Most of the prejudice against religious minorities in Pakistan can be traced to the effort by Islamist radicals, both intellectual and physical radicals, to make Pakistan purer as to what they conceive to be an Islamic state. Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had advanced the case for a secular, albeit Muslim-majority Pakistan. In all except the first phase of Pakistan's birth, the Ahmadiyya or Ahmadi community has often been a major target of bigotry. After the partition-era violence, the first major religious riots in Pakistan targeted the Ahmadi community in 1953. Why is Pakistan important, and why am I speaking to you about it out of all the countries where Ahmadis may live? Well, Pakistan is home to the largest Ahmadi community in the world, and it is the first country to constitutionally and legally discriminate against Ahmadis. Pakistan is therefore the center of anti-Ahmadiyya prejudice and violence, which has now unfortunately spread to other Muslim-majority countries, which my colleague will get to in a little while. Today, the total population of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan is 207 million. It is 96% Muslim, with Ahmadis comprising around 0.22% of the population, which is around 4 to 5 million people. So you would think with such a small minority, why are so many Pakistani Muslims, Sunni groups, and in some cases even Shia groups, trying so hard to oppress the Ahmadi in every way? Why? They're so small in numbers. Well, to go back to it, Pakistan today is considered one of the worst violators of religious freedom in the entire world. So it's a microcosm of all the human rights and religious freedom issues you see elsewhere. At the time of partition in 1947, almost 23% of Pakistan's population, which then included Bangladesh, comprised of non-Muslim citizens, so almost a quarter of Pakistan's population was non-Muslim. Today, the proportion of non-Muslims has fallen to approximately 3%. So how did this happen? Well, part of it started with the Ahmadi community, who were declared non-Muslim by the writ of the state since 1974 through a constitutional amendment. So a community that had always considered itself Muslim was deemed non-Muslim through the constitution and laws, and today are therefore pariahs because they consider themselves belonging to the Muslim community. But the Muslim community violently and non-violently does everything in its possibility, including the state, to persecute the Ahmadis. The Ahmadi community in Pakistan, these are a few things I think you should take away with you, are forbidden by law from describing themselves as Muslims, from using the term mosque for their places of worship, from publicly calling the azan before prayers. They risk a stiff jail sentence for violating ordinances that forbid them from any act that might identify themselves as followers of Islam. In January of this year, a student in Pakistan shot his high school principal dead after being reprimanded for skipping school to attend a sit-in organized by one of Pakistan's Islamist extremist parties. The killer, the student, argued that the principal had committed blasphemy by questioning the right of the student to attend the sit-in, which was condemning blasphemers. The sit-in had been organized by Tehreek-e-Labbaik Ya Rasulallah, or the Movement for the Call of Allah's Prophet, only the latest addition to Pakistan's pantheon of extremist groups. Instead of enforcing the law against the small number of TLYR extremist protesters, the civilian government of Pakistan was forced to accept their demands. With the country's army chief acting as negotiator, a truce was signed between the government and the extremist leader. Witnesses spotted military officers giving money to some of the protesters, raising suspicion that the protests had been engineered to further undermine the authority of the civilians. What was one of the major demands of these extremists, who both the civilian government and the military chief gave a free pass? One of their main demands was Pakistan Ahmadi citizens not be allowed to vote alongside the majority Muslim population. Now you strip them of their religion officially. You have taken away almost all their rights. You've made them almost non-citizens in every way. And now when you have these extremists demanding they not be allowed to vote alongside Pakistani Muslims, the army chief shows up himself, brokers a deal with these extremists. The civilian government of Pakistan comes in also and makes a deal with the extremists. So what does that tell you about Pakistan? It's from the top down and the bottom up. And that's how you know you have a society that is very, very dangerous for Ahmadis and all people of religious minorities. Welcome to everyone. I'm sorry, I was in the middle of, shall I continue? Ahmadis already bear the brunt of Pakistan's repressive laws and the widespread antipathy towards religious minorities in Pakistan society. They are effectively disenfranchised and constantly targeted for repression. In March of this year, the Islamabad High Court ruled that all citizens must declare their religion when applying for identity documents and re-emphasize the need for a declaration that set Ahmadis apart from Muslims. Once again, now you've deemed them non-Muslim, you've taken away your rights, but in March of this year, you have the Islamabad High Court once again stressing this point. According to the judgment of the court, citizens who disguise their religious affiliation were guilty of betraying the state, treason, and that the government of Pakistan shall take special measure ensuring availability of correct particulars of all the citizens, and it should not be possible for any citizen to hide his or her identity and recognition. The Human Rights Watch representative in Pakistan pointed out that the judge was, I'm quoting, not only attacking everyone's religious freedom in Pakistan, but he's also focusing on one particular sect, which is the Ahmadis. Prejudice against Ahmadis has only increased over the last few years, and Justice Siddiqui's judgment, as well as the army chief's indirect support for TLYR, shows how the Pakistani state endorses the prejudice. The beginning of the holy month of Ramadan this year was marked by extremist Sunni Muslims in the town of Sialkot destroying a 100-year-old Ahmadi mosque. They were led by a local politician belonging to the Tehreek-e-Insaf party, a cricketer turned politician Imran Khan, who is hoping to be the next Prime Minister of Pakistan. And Mr. Khan and his supporters have often publicly spoken about the fact that Ahmadis are not Muslims, and in disparaging ways about other religious minorities in Pakistan, like Hindus and like Christians. Since the passage of the Anti-Ahmadi Ordinance 20 by General Zia in 1984, more than 264 Ahmadis have been killed for their faith. 182 of these happened in Punjab province. Since Ahmadis were declared to be non-Muslim, 27 of their mosques have been demolished, 33 sealed, 21 set on fire, 17 forcibly occupied, and authorities prevented the construction of 17 Ahmadi mosques. The injustice and blatant disregard for international norms in treating a person from a religious minority is exemplified in the case of Mr. Abdul Shakur, an optician who was 80 years old at the time he was arrested in 2015 for merely possessing Ahmadi religious literature. Mr. Shakur was charged with propagating the Ahmadiyya faith, a crime under the Pakistani Penal Code, and stirring up religious hatred and sectarianism, a crime under the 1997 Anti-Terrorism Act. Today he is 82 years old and remains in prison for nothing more than keeping books pertaining to his religion at his own workplace. I will stop here so we can move forward, but in the question and answers, if anyone has anything specific, I'll be ready to answer.
Thank you, Farnaz. And we've been joined by representatives here in the government. I wanted to turn the floor over to you all, since you have very busy schedules, and we'll get back to Eric. Sorry about this. But I'll turn the floor over to you all if you want to make some comments.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here with our distinguished panelists and those of you in the audience. And thank you for coming to our briefing on the human rights and religious freedom issues facing the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I also want to thank my colleague, Congressman Jackie Spear, a fellow member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and co-chair of the Congressional Ahmadiyya Muslim Caucus. And our thanks to the caucus for co-hosting today's event. And I want to express my appreciation to my constituents who have kept me informed about the discrimination that Ahmadiyya Muslims face all over the world. The Ahmadiyya Muslim movement originated in northern India in the late 19th century. Its founder, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, saw himself as a renewer of Islam chosen by Allah. Ahmadiyya Islam stresses nonviolence, religious toleration, and it places a high priority on the building of mosques, schools, and hospitals. Unfortunately, some Muslims view Ahmadiyya Islam as heretical because it recognizes a prophet following Muhammad. This has led to persecution and discrimination against Ahmadiyya Muslims worldwide. In Pakistan, a 1974 constitutional amendment declared Ahmadis non-Muslims. A decade later, new laws ban Ahmadis from identifying themselves as Muslims, calling their places of worship mosques, and propagating their faith in any way, directly or indirectly. They are barred from reciting the Quran or using traditional Islamic readings. Ahmadis in Pakistan are also some of the most common defendants in criminal charges of blasphemy, which can carry the death penalty. They have been targeted under Pakistan's anti-terrorism laws. Attacks committed against them by mobs and militant groups take place with impunity. And I want to mention one man in particular who's been a victim of this legal discrimination. Abdul Shakur is an 80-year-old bookseller from the city of Rabwa, where many Ahmadis reside. In 2015, police raided Abdul's shop, arrested him, and accused him of selling an Ahmadiyya commentary on the Quran, among other publications. Authorities charged him with printing, publishing, and disseminating any material to incite hatred and insulting religion. He's serving a combined 8 years in prison on these charges. Abdul